Like to wish everybody a happy day worldwide, and today we're talking with Dr. Irena Scott. And as you may know, in 1973, two gentlemen, Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, earned overnight fame as they unknowingly became part of the most documented UFO case in history. That, of course, has been called the Pascagoula event. In the last almost 50 years, more details have emerged and witnesses have come forward. Joining me is Dr. Irena Scott, of course, who has done her own bit of research and has authored the book Beyond Pascagoula. Dr. Irena Scott, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. Last time we had a great conversation about one of your most recent books, and since then you've been, of course, very busy. The Pascagoula event is one of those things that sticks in my brain more than any, because when I was a kid, for a brief time in the rural Montana area that I grew up in, the local radio station had a radio show about 10 minutes before 10 minutes before 8 a.m. every morning called the UFO Report. And one of the first things I was able to hear was about the Pascagoula event, as well as the Travis Walton abduction. And both of those events scared the wits about me, especially the Pascagoula event, because the description of what happened was so vivid, as well as the description of the creature that Calvin and Charlie had seen while fishing that evening. And so it's pretty amazing. And more evidence have come forward, more people have come forward in almost 50 years since then. So how did you jump on board, and when did that happen? And tell me why, because it seems like one of those things that we might have found out all kinds of information about, but obviously there's been more.
Yes. The way I found out was something happened in my family at that same time, but I didn't know anything about it until, something happened to me too, but it wasn't something I paid attention to until quite a few years later. And then I discovered it was at the same time as a Pascagoula abduction, but I didn't pay too much attention to the abduction. I just paid attention to the other aspect. Would you want to know what happened to me?
Yeah, tell me what happened to you, because I know at that particular time, I always say there anywhere people from the age of 48 years old to 68 years old were experiencing things back then, and it seemed to be sort of a starting point. So what happened to you back then?
What happened to me was I was at the University of Missouri working on my PhD, and my mother was in Ohio near Columbus, which was about 600 miles away. And one night she called me and asked me if I heard a noise. And I thought that was a crazy question. And she had always said if she had dementia that we should tell her immediately so she knows to go to the doctor. And so I really kidded her and, told her to go to the doctor, go to the insane asylum, get locked up and everything, and kidded her about it. But I wondered why she called and exactly why. And so later several days later, she called and said they were having a huge UFO wave. Everybody was seeing them. UFOs had chased her friend's car, and people were staying in at night and keeping their kids in. And it sounded like a terrorist situation. And she was a skeptic. And so nothing like that was going on at Missouri, and I just ignored it for quite a long time. But it would have been on October the 11th, the same time as the Pascagoula abduction. And so later I was working at Ohio State University, and they had a newspaper room. And so just on a whim, I thought I'd go in and look for that story. And I got in a newspaper room, and there were just newspapers in all directions, and they looked like thousands of newspapers for that date and everything else. And so I thought, well, I'll never find it. But I guessed it was October and guessed it was near the middle of October, which is just a wild guess. And I found it really quickly. And so it told about this strange noise. And then it seemed sort of weird that there'd be a strange noise and people over about half the United States would hear it, but nobody knew what caused it. And so I started doing some research on it and put in a draft of a write-up on it. And the state of Ohio seismologist was quite interested, and he helped me find seismograph records and things like that. And so I actually published it in the peer-reviewed scientific journal. But I wasn't even into UFOs then. And several people from MUFON and from that were interested in UFOs invited me to a meeting to give a talk. And that's how I got into UFOs. So something about the Pascagoula thing actually brought me into the UFO organizations.
So prior to looking up that information, what was your limited knowledge of UFOs at the time? What have you heard of, or had you heard of prior to Pascagoula?
Well, I had experiences, but back in those days, you didn't talk about it. And so I was dormant on anything like that. But, and even after I found out that this was the same time as the abduction, I didn't have too much interest in the abduction. I was just kind of interested in why my mother would call me from Ohio and what the noise was. And so I looked at that and tried to do it in a scientific way of finding where the noise was and what it was and everything else, but they never seemed to explain it.
One of the unique aspects of that event in Pascagoula was what Charlie and mostly Calvin had described that creature that he'd seen as possibly some kind of robot. So it was a very, very strange creature. Do you know of any other events where people have described that same creature with the really odd carrot shape protrusions out of its head, and it's just a really odd looking thing?
The other reason I was in this with Pascagoula is that I'd had my books published by Philip Mantle in his Flying Disc Press, and he had asked me to interview other witnesses at Pascagoula, and that was the second reason. No, they're what they saw. They thought the things were mechanical, like robots or something, and they were a lot different than anybody else reported, because other people seemed to report slender beings with big heads and huge eyes. And these were about as opposite you could get. They were kind of porky looking with lots of wrinkles. I don't even know if they saw their eyes, and they had protrusions where their nose and their ears were, which wasn't anything that had been described before. And I think it's not what people report afterwards either.
Right. And it was quite unusual and quite terrifying, I know, for those gentlemen. And so you've gotten into this, let's say not more recently, but it has been something that maybe you thought about for a while. So when you started working on this specifically, I mean, how many more people did you discover that were coming out with more stories about this? And was it dramatic, or was it hard to find these people?
Well, I think it had been earlier, because like Calvin, he didn't want to talk about it for the next 40 years or so. It happened in 73. And just in the last 2 or 3 years when he wrote his book was when he talked about it. And he hadn't even talked to his wife much. But the other people also didn't report it. But back then, the sheriff's, somebody in the sheriff's office said they had, that same night as the abduction, they had received 50 calls that were recorded, and they'd seen received a lot more. So there was something strongly going on then, but people didn't come out and say anything. And now we're finally, now that it's more open about UFOs and more acceptable, well, people are talking about it. So we're finding new witnesses right along, even now.
So as the community opened up, and are they more accepting of that event and willing to talk about it? Because at one point, I mean, at that in 1973, it was obviously sort of taboo to bring up things like that, and when people did, they were ostracized, of course, that as they have been for years. But so as the community opened up now, and it's more accepted, and people are more giving you more access to that information. Is that what have happened over the last decade or so?
Yes, and most people mention that back then they wouldn't have said anything about it because of the harassment and everything. You can imagine shipyard workers that they could harass
Absolutely, yeah,
pretty hard.
yeah.
And so, yeah, practically everybody's mentioned that they didn't want to go out on record or anything back then, but that now that things are more accepted like that.
That's really interesting because, you know, it's like Roswell. It seems like we keep churning up more information, and as this story actually and seemingly develops into something even more dramatic, you know, it's in the back of my mind, and I always wonder. You know, it's been one of those things that I'd like to visit, but I haven't had the chance. Did you get to spend much time in the town itself and the area and talking to people?
Roswell or Pascagoula?
Pascagoula.
Oh, well, no, I haven't even been to Pascagoula, but I've talked to a lot of people there.
Right. So are people coming to you now, and now that you have the book out, and you know, are there even more people? Because I think one of the things that I began to realize was that you know, Calvin himself, he's just this super great guy, super nice guy, and he kept us inside so long, and you know, it wasn't really a healthy thing for him to do, because it's been kind of hard on him over the almost 50 years.
Well, I interviewed his wife a few weeks ago, and that was the first she'd been interviewed. And so I got sort of inside information on that. And she said he didn't want to talk about it until he started writing the book, which was many, 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 many years afterwards. And that's when he talked to her about it. So, and she I think she kind of made up her mind that he was going to start talking, and then Philip Mantle got a hold of him and started talking to him too. And he trusted both of them and everything. And so he finally started talking about it, but he was nervous for quite a long time. But she said that they both were a lot better now that he had got it out in the open and talked about it.
So when you were writing this book, let's talk about what you actually found. Was there something unique that that came out more recently in your book that people didn't know about, and what would that be? I mean, not to be, we want people to look at your book, but you know, obviously there's some things in there that that are pretty amazing, and different events that we wouldn't have expected.
Well, there were quite even in his abduction, you mentioned that the beings looked odd, or whatever the things were. Well, when he was abducted, it was like something the size of a deck of cards came out and circled him, like it was scanning him. And that's something new to science, because even today, you have to lay down on a thing and be pushed into this big thing and for a CAT scan. And this seemed like more advanced than today's science. And they thought the beings gave them a shot or something to put them out, because they were healthy men and they wouldn't, you know, just go in a UFO or anything like that. And they said that just like that, they were just weak and couldn't fight back, but they were conscious. And that's some conscious sedation is something that, you know, hasn't been with people for very long. And a number of things like that. Another thing is that a lot of people have come forward and said they saw it. And you wouldn't normally, if somebody asked you what you did on October the 11th, 1973, you wouldn't know. But a lot of people had seen things, and then they remember it because a day later they heard about the abduction. And so they remember that date. And so a number of people are coming forth. And the very first people I talked to were the Blair family, and they didn't, their daughter just made a comment on a YouTube video about Calvin, and Philip Maddle found it and contacted her. And so he asked me to call the mother, who was one of the witnesses. And so I did. Well, the mother told me this story about that she and her husband worked on a boat, and it was at the end of a pier. And he was waiting for his supervisor to come to go out on the ship, and his supervisor was late. So they were sitting in the car waiting, and he decided to go to sleep. And she was looking around and saw this thing flying around. And she thought, this is the weirdest thing I ever saw. And it was just flying up and down and around and all that. And she said it looked like the pilot was lost, that he just kept flying in different directions and across and everything. And she couldn't figure out what was going on. They were parked directly across the Pascagoula River from where the abduction took place. And of course, they didn't know about the abduction or anything then. And so then her husband decided to take his clothes to the boat and walk down the pier, and she walked down behind him. And she said this thing that looked like a human came up out of the water right beside her. And she just seemed really shocked about it and really emotional. And that was about 9 o'clock, and they went to the ship. And then she said that she came back about 12. Well, the whole thing didn't make too much sense to me, because for one thing, she was just really emotional about the thing that came out of the water. And I kept calling her and asking her about that a number of times. And the whole thing didn't make sense. Well, later, I had talked to her husband just very briefly, and he was a skeptic, and she said she thought this thing was weird that came out of the water. And her husband always said, shut up about it, don't talk about it, and all that. And when I talked to him, he talked about a big splash and maybe seeing a blimp. And then he really quickly handed the phone over to her, and she gave her description. And so he had always been a skeptic and a debunker, and told her to keep her mouth shut. Well, unfortunately, he became ill, and he died, unfortunately. And right before he went on a ventilator, he told her as a sort of a death message that they had been abducted by UFOs and that he didn't want to ever talk about it. And so he remembered it and said he'd been aboard and that these creatures had caught him, and then they had swam away from him through the water. And she thinks that that's what she saw when she saw the being swim up toward her. But unfortunately, then he went on a ventilator and he couldn't talk. And so she didn't find out too much more about it, and he died. But she's trying to piece it together now. She doesn't remember being aboard anything, but she remembers the object, and she remembers the real bright light and things like that. So it was as if they had been abducted also, and possibly by the same object that abducted Calvin and Charles. And so this is truly, truly something unusual that hasn't been reported before, that possibly there were two abductions that took place around the same time and place.
One of the things that I wondered about is, since we do have more witness testimony, and you've looked into this, have you gotten a general sense of what happened that night? I mean, was it multiple crafts with multiple abductions? Was it a single craft or a couple of craft? And what size of an area are we talking about that people were having these real similar experiences with? Because it sounds like there's so many different types of humanoid like objects wandering around, not just the ones like Calvin and Charlie had seen. So area wise, how big of an area did this happen in? And did you get a sense that this was a mass abduction of sorts?
No, they're about the only people that reported an abduction, but several other people reported things that were as if something tried to abduct them. And these, some of these men were out on the place called Dolphin Island, which is at the end of the Pascagoula River, just beyond where the abduction took place. And they had taken a dune buggy out to do something and got the dune buggy stuck. And they were trying to get it out. And then this thing came over them. That was the same night, and shone a bright light on them, real bright. They said so bright they could see colors in the grains of sand. And they were just absolutely terrified and managed to get the dune buggy out really fast, even though they hadn't been able to do anything before then, and went home. And so that is, and several other things sounded like something tried to abduct some other people too. But I don't know if you could tell whether it was the same thing or not, because it was night and something could look different or shine different lights or something like that. I mean, if you had an airplane, it had a blue light on for a while and then it had a green light on for a while, you might say, well, this is two different things. And so I don't know, since it was night and dark, exactly what the thing would have looked like. It looked like one thing to Calvin and Charles, but it might have looked like something else to somebody else.
Just like trying to remember a crime or, anything super important. Our memory is not exactly perfect. And I think those people that provided some witness statement, they've been pressured a bit to, obviously we want to know exact details of what happened. When you look at things like this, and you in your professional world, you're very educated and have some other insight into this. Is it just that common for people to have such a disparity in witness testimony? Because it is hard to remember exact details. And I think that we expect them to remember too much in detail, and often we're disappointed. But it's not unusual, is it, for people to have varied testimony?
Well, no, it's not. And that was a long time ago. And I'm surprised people are consistent enough, because after that long, you might think, well, it'd be a vast, vast difference. But in general, people sort of report something similar.
Yeah. So since the books came out, and the book's only been out since August, correct?
I don't know when it came out. We didn't find out. Came out. It was supposed to come out the 1st of October. We found out it was earlier.
Right. So yeah, 1st of October, and obviously we're at the, what is it, the 48th anniversary, like right now, of that event.
Yeah, tomorrow will be the exact anniversary. And we were planning to have the book come out then, and it came out earlier than we suspected, and nobody knew anything about it when it came out.
So the massive sonic boom-like sound that people heard, when did we first start hearing about that? Because that was something that, I read about in your information and the book excerpt. So was that, how long has that been known that people, for hundreds of miles had heard that loud boom?
It was like almost 1,000 miles. It was huge. And it made newspaper headlines right across about half the United States in segments. I mean, the farthest west seemed to hear it first, and then in increments right up to the coast. It was pretty amazing, but people seemed to forget about it really fast, and nobody seemed to investigate or pay much attention to it. I think it's because nothing was seen. And so they just didn't pay attention, even though it went over Washington, D.C. and places like that. And so far as I know, not many people have paid attention to it except me.
And there's also some damage, I think, reported. Is that correct?
Yes, there is. It was first heard in Iowa, and the sound traveled to the Atlantic coast, or it was last heard in a city near the Atlantic coast. And yeah, there were shattered windows and things like that. I mean, people ran out of their houses thinking their houses had exploded. People called the fire department, several fire departments actually had runs and people thought there were explosions in different places and investigated for explosions. It was really something.
So your professional career spans many, many decades, you know, we're talking about Ohio State and Missouri College of Veterinary. So you have this vast amount of experience and knowledge. You know, it's one of the interesting things right now that we have a lot of professional people coming forward who even have tenure at different universities who've written books, you know, including, you know, Dr. Avi Loeb and people like that, written books about extraterrestrials. So when was it that you began to show interest, or were you looked at from your peers as somebody who has been studying that? Because obviously it's kind of a hard thing to break into when you have this professional career. So how did that happen, and how did your peers react to that, and when did that happen? Because it seems like a lot of people are doing it more recent, but back then, you know, years ago, it was a different story.
Well, I had several experiences, and I was lucky to have other people in them. So I wasn't just like it was crazy or something. But my sister and I had experience when we were really, really young, and then other ones. But like our parents said, don't talk about that. And I was obviously odd because I was female in science, which some places I was the only one there. And so I did not go around saying I see UFOs, besides being weird. This is the only female. And so eventually, when I started looking into that sound, I was working, and I didn't go around telling people, but people found out some way that I was in the UFOs. That was many, many years later, though. And yeah, I got harassed. Everybody said, "You seen any UFOs today?" and all that.
I talked to you previously, and we had talked about your work related to government. I don't remember how you started that. Did they approach you, or did you approach the federal government in starting that bit of work?
Well, I had always wanted to be an astronomer, and that's what I started out college majoring in. And I started applying for jobs, and I wasn't even allowed to apply because it was male only back then. All this one ads that say male only and female only and all that. Well, I wasn't allowed to apply, so I had to change my major. But I still wanted to go into astronomy, and I couldn't figure out how. And so the government started hiring females in cartography, which is mapping, and they were mapping the moon and things. And so I thought, well, I'll try that. But I didn't wind up mapping the moon. And then I got this real high security clearance, and I wound up in the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And one of my jobs there was, most of it was in satellite photography, but one part of it was identifying airplanes over communist areas. And so that's how I got into that. And then I wasn't successful getting into astronomy. And then I got married, and went into, eventually got a PhD from veterinary college.
So when you were working with the federal government and in your job as a DIA, how often were there actual conversations about unidentified objects and or UAPs and UFOs in that particular job, or was that something that you brought into it?
Well, I didn't go around saying I saw a UFO, but my sister and I had experience while I was working there, and it was pretty scary. And I mentioned UFOs at work. I mean, I didn't say I saw anything or, relate it to me. I just said, oh, isn't that interesting? Somebody saw a UFO or something. And I was in Air Order Battle Department of identifying airplanes. And I found out that my supervisors had reported a UFO on our class. It was real classified work. I think the photography is still classified. It was real high security clearance, but they said they had reported a UFO, and I looked it up and saw it on their very classified photography. And they were experts, the top experts for our particular area of the world. And they reported it to their supervisors, and their supervisors said it was a spot on the film and didn't exist. Well, it wasn't a spot because it was on two different pictures, and you could even change the size and get it in stereo. So it definitely wasn't a spot, and their supervisors kept insisting it was a spot, which made no sense at all photographically. And they were both pretty surprised and didn't understand that, and didn't understand why what their supervisors said didn't make any sense either. And so way back then, I sort of suspected something was going on in the government, that there was some concealment or something, especially the DIA.
Any reason to believe or understand, or I'm sorry, is there any reason to believe that they have an agenda to conceal this information? Because obviously, you have millions of people who want to find out. You have millions of people who file Freedom of Information Act requests and get this redacted information. What would be your estimate of why that this has been concealed and we're unable to get the full story?
Well, I think back in 1947, when they had Project Sign, which is a precursor Project Blue Book, way back then, they gave estimate of the situation, that sort of thing, that these might be extraterrestrial. They're anomalous to what we understand about science and all that. Then Project Sign turned into Project Grudge, and they debunked everything about UFOs. Then that turned into Project Blue Book, and they debunked and debunked and debunked and said they don't exist, that people understand everything about the universe. There can't be anything they don't understand. They know all about UFOs and they don't exist and all that. And so more recently this year, the government came out and even admitted that they don't know what's going on. But that admission was, it's like going back to 1947 when they first admitted that. So I'm sure that, on the type of photography we had, they probably have UFO photographs that they, that some people know about. And the ones that made the big news with the Nimitz and the Princeton and everything, those were DIA videos. So I'm sure they have. And back then, when I worked for the DIA, I thought something was going on. So I think they're finally coming out again and saying something is flying around that we don't know about.
Yeah, there seems to be that admission, but I guess one of the things that always sticks out in my mind that from somewhere in between 1936 and 1947, supposedly our government collected real data, hard evidence about UFO activity, and yet now we have to have a specific task force to research, what the Navy is experiencing and their different experiences. So it's strange to me that we have all this information, yet now it's a big mystery, and we have to employ these people to study that. Are we really studying that right now, or is it just a ruse?
Well, I had the feeling from the rejection that my supervisors got that somebody knew something. One of my supervisors, I think, was a GS-14 or a real high level, and he apparently didn't have a security clearance for it. And you're not even sure if the presidents have the security clearance for it. But I think deep in the bowels of the government, something's going on. But I don't know. I just don't know. I mean, that was just my suspicion way back. And there's all kinds of theories, every theory you can think of. And so obviously, if they had technology like what they think UFOs can do, they could take over the world. Any country that had that technology could. So they probably, they wouldn't want everybody in the world to know what they know. But nevertheless, they may not know anything anyway.
Yeah, I think it would be a huge surprise, and if something dramatic or exceedingly dangerous happened to the planet because of our inability to share information about what's really out there. But at the same time, I've been disappointed in the past about our own federal government and how they've reacted, and specifically maybe 9/11. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, I thought we had something in place to protect against something like that. Where actual humans or terrorists are infiltrating, our own border and causing destruction and death. So to me, it would seem to enhance our security if we were able to collect this technology. But to me, so far, we have this amazing technology in our country for sure, but I don't think that we're really taking full advantage of it. How could we take fully advantage of it? I mean, that's a weird question, but I think that we need to look forward to our future to ensure that we don't have something happen that we regret.
What I think, they ought to release the information, because there's lots of geniuses walking around in the world that might be able to figure things out. And instead, it seems like they're keeping it classified and not releasing information, which seems like, if we got attacked or something, we should know about it. And we'd want the top people to try to figure out what to do. And there may be all kinds of top people that don't know a thing about it, never heard about it. So I think they ought to release the information. I mean, some of it is like with the photography. They don't want, other countries to know how good our photography is and that sort of thing. So they don't release the information, but they ought to release something. And so I just don't know. And it may not be technology. It may be something that we just don't understand at all. I mean, like in my book, we talked about, people saw UFOs flying along in the air like an aircraft, but then they seem to be coming out of the water and all that too. Well, and they seem to just go in the water and just fly along as happily as they did in the air. And with us, we need a submarine or an airplane. They're not the same thing. And with UFOs, they seem to be able to go through any media, which is totally different from what we have. And there's also reports of UFO phenomenon going through walls and things like that, and levitating. I mean, they don't seem to have propellers or anything or any normal way of flying. And so it seemed like, I don't know if it's technology or just there's something that we just don't understand yet.
And at times, I listen to these different accounts and stories and research that people do, and you know, if you look at it in this direction, that here's the highly technical, obviously, species of something, and you know, they at times seem totally oblivious to us even being here, which to me makes a lot of sense, because you know, what are we? You know, we're on the food chain, so to speak, for lack of a better term. I mean, to me, technologically, we seem to be way down there at the bottom compared to multiple civilizations or species of things out there in space. So, you know, are we a stepping stone? Are we a something that really they don't matter that we're here at all? Because at times it seems they just go and do their thing without knowingly interacting with us. So having said that, I guess, you know, we're people who are hungry for information, and we're not getting that information that we require. So you know, we have so many more people that are interested in this and are doing research now. Do you find that problematic, that we have all these people doing research and heading off in so many different directions and not sharing information? Because obviously people have agendas. They want to write books. They want to be on TV, but um, should people keep it to themselves, or is there, you know, other than people or groups like MUFON and things like that, there's really not a forum for people to share that globally? And how could we share that information, and should we share that information with each other?
Yeah, I think we should share all the information we have, and that other people too, but everybody doesn't agree with me. But I think it's probably, the UFO phenomenon is something very, very complex. It may involve quantum mechanics and all that we don't understand at all, and we probably don't have the brains wired up in such a way that we understand it very well. And so it also might involve mind control. And so altogether, I think it's just way complex. And it's like we're sort of trying to understand it with Newtonian mechanics from way, way back. And with the quantum mechanics theories, things are a whole lot different than, you know, just the clockwork universe. And I think we need to understand quantum mechanics. And I think what quantum mechanics is actually weirder than UFOs. And that if we try to understand that better, UFOs might fit into our world the way they do now. They don't really fit in, and nobody believes it because, you know, nothing else just floats through the air and levitates and all that.
I don't remember what year it was, but you were a volunteer astronomer at Ohio State University. Of course, they're noted for the WOW SETI signal. They have the big ear telescope. Were you involved in that in any way? What year were you there?
I was there afterwards, but I knew everybody that was involved, and they're still interested. That they don't think it's been explained yet. And they tore down the telescope years ago. And they set it up with some more telescopes, but I don't know if it's very active now at all.
So what was your impression of that event and did you get to look at that very closely?
Yeah, it was, I mean, with the way the telescope picked it up, it looked like a real signal from out in space. They didn't explain it as anything else, but they've really looked at the same coordinates and not been able to get anything again. So, but it's been actively investigated, but nobody's found anything since then.
I think it's really unfortunate that you have universities that own a piece of equipment like that, and then it, you know, gets, I know it's really expensive to maintain that, and obviously technology's taken over and we have new types of equipment, but you know, that old equipment was quite amazing, and it would be wonderful if we could keep that around for a long time, because it's pretty cool stuff, and obviously there were some pretty exciting things that happened.
Yeah, they did a, you know, radio sky survey of radio signals and things like that. but they sold the land for a golf course and took down the telescope. The telescope's something really unique, so it is a shame that they took it down and sold the land to make a golf course.
I know I'm not sure how involved you were with the Popular Mechanics, but I know you're a correspondent with Popular Mechanics, and over the it's got to be close to 75 years of Popular Mechanics or more. They've published articles about UFOs and technology, and that was one of the kind of the old school go-to places where you'd get thrown that little tidbit from time to time and get to enjoy one of those articles. Did you ever have a chance to do that for Popular Mechanics?
I wrote about astronomy. I didn't write about UFOs, so no.
Yeah.
I didn't even try it. Maybe I should have, though.
And I'm not saying it came out that often, but when I was a kid, and had the opportunity to see that or go to the grocery store, back in the mid 70s, and you'd see that, and not always about UFOs, but there'd be a photo or some artwork on the cover that would depict something similar. And that was me hopeful, always grabbing that off the rack to be able to read something. And it didn't happen that often, but when it did, it was just amazing. So that's, those old radio telescopes and articles, and being able to read that, to me, was one of the better eras of information, only because there probably wasn't as much information, but the way it was laid out there was spectacular. So I think you're lucky to be able to do research in those time periods, including now, because it's changed a lot. What are the changes you could see in the future? Because obviously, information is just pounded with it daily, and it's a good thing and a bad thing, because obviously you and I both have seen things on the internet and Facebook that it's created and it's not real. I mean, where's the truth going to come out, and when are we going to be able to rely on our news a little bit more, especially with this topic?
Well, I hope more scientists get into it. I think the best investigations ever done were done by scientists. And I worked at Battelle, and they had spatial report number 14, which is a Battelle study of UFOs way back in 1953. And I think that was just top science. They had good scientists and did a statistical study of the observations. And Harley Rutledge, a physics professor in 1973, in a project called Project Identification, went out and did a field study of UFOs during that flap. And he did a really good, excellent study, which nobody paid attention to. And then now that the SCU of MUFON is investigating UFOs and trying to do scientific work. And I just hope that more peer-reviewed literature will take the publish things about it. That was why I was interested in that sound back then, was because they always say UFOs are something that happens in the dark depths of the night to one person, and they're secretive and everything. And this happened across the country with millions of witnesses, which is unlike the normal type of thing. It was never explained. And so I was saying, and this went over like Washington, D.C. and top population centers, the sound. And so it wasn't something hidden or anything, but people forgot about it and didn't pay attention to it. And so I was trying to say, that it isn't all subtle stuff. There's mystery things that you can still collect information on and try to figure out. And with that, I could do calculations and things because I had enough data. But I think the literature ought to be more open-minded to investigating things. And I imagine the government is in different places besides Harry Reid and everything is, but they don't openly pay scientists to do work on it. And if they offered money, they might collect a lot more scientists working.
Yeah. And but unfortunately, you know, there's no unlimited resource of money, and when there is money available, it's spread pretty thin. So, Dr. Irena Scott, thank you so much for being with me. Where can people find you on the internet? I know you have a website, irenascott.com, and talk about that just briefly, and where else can they find you?
My books are on Amazon.com, and just look for the name of my books and my name, and you should be able to find it. And my website, it lists my books, and you just click on a book and it goes right to the Amazon.com place to order it.
How many books do you have now?
I have 3 now.
Right. All available on Amazon. And when we last spoke, I was able to read one of your books, and yeah, it's awesome. Nice to have you here again, Dr. Irena Scott. Thank you so much. The music you heard tonight on the program is by Eleon. You can find Eleon's music on Heart Dance Records. Tonight's audio video engineer and producer is Cassidae Lighwing, and I'm Cam Logan. Be sure to listen to my previous shows, available everywhere you find podcasts, including Dr. Irena Scott on our last program. And this is My Alien Life. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you for your wonderful questions, which I can't necessarily answer.
Good night. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.